Good morning, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm Rabbi Evan Crane. This is the Jewish Studio, and we are thrilled to have all of you here with us this morning. Our program this morning has three intersecting parts. We'll begin with music. We'll return to music. We'll hear from Rabbi Michael Verenbaum and then Rabbi Michael Paley. The theme of this morning is to explore what has transpired in Jewish Europe over the last century by connecting different points from culture to Shoah, to the depths, to the rebirth of Jewish Europe. So with that slight introduction, I offer to you Chazan Basha Schechter, Rabbi Ann Cantor, Jessica Kate Meyer, and guitarist extraordinaire, Oren Naaman.
We're going to begin with the partisaner lead. Never say that this is the final road for you. Though leaden skies may cover over days of blue, I didn't write this translation. As the hour that we longed for is so near, our step beats out the message, we are here.
Sog ne kemol als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Gott schimle bleien verstellen neue Tag. Kommen weg nach unser ausgebänkte Schor. Zwert abbeug von unser Blut wir seinen da. Kommen weg nach unser ausgebänkte Schor. Zwert abbeug wir seinen da, von grünen Palmenland bis weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen mit und einen Winterweg, und wo gefallen ist, spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen weg dort unser Gwore, unser Mut, und wo gefallen ist, spritzt von unser Blut. Unser Mut. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und mit der Blei. Es ist nicht kein Liedl von a Vogel läuft der frei. Das hat a Fox zwischen von dick gewähnt. Das Lied gesungen mit na Gannes in der Hand. Das hat a Fox zwischen von dick gewähnt. Das Lied gesungen mit ner Gannes in die Hand. Es wird abheugt und unser Tod mir seinen da. Es wird abheugt und unser ausgebänkter Schor. Es wird abheugt und unser Tod mir seinen da.
The next piece we're going to do is one of those songs that you hear it and you're all of a sudden brought back to the time before the war, to a place where people sat around fireplaces and where kids were studying the alphabet and learning the vowels and learning the letters and putting it together and threading a tradition from generation to generation with access to the most incredible, incredible book that we share together, the language that we share together. And it's like you hear it, and the tears start to flow sometimes. So let them flow if they flow.
I want to add one more thing, which is that I learned last night that Chazan Basia has sung this to her son every night before sleep, and he's 7.
6.5.
6.5. He's a mature 6.5.
Just lost his second tooth last night. Okay, anyways. And there's like a little variation that I do because when you sing it every night for 6 years, there's like sometimes you kind of play around the melody a little bit because you sing it so often. So there's like one little line that's a little different than the actual. So you might notice that.
Auf im Hüppecheck brennt a Feier und ein Sturm ist heiß und die Rebben lernen kleine Kinderlach dem Aleph Beis und die Rebben lernen kleine Kinderlach dem Aleph Beis. Solche Kinderlach Gedenkstätte was lernt du, solche noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, kommet's alle vor. Solche noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, kommet's alle vor. Lernt Kinder mit größer Geschick, also ich sage Chaychon. Das weg ich von euch kennen Ivre, der bekommt davon. Das weg ich von euch kennen Ivre, der bekommt davon. Solche Kinderlach, gedenkst Tage, was lernt du. Solche noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, kommet's alle vor. Solche noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, kommet's alle vor. Als ihr werdet Kinder dem Golles schleppen, euch gemutschen sein, sollt ihr vor die euch Kajach scheppen, guckt in See herein. Sollt ihr von die euch Kajach scheppen, guckt in See herein. Solche Kinderlach, gedenkst Tage, was es lernt du. Solche nach einmal und Tage nach einmal, kommet's alle vor. Solche nach einmal und Tage nach einmal, kommet's alle vor.
People. And sometimes among those wonderful people, you get to meet somebody really extraordinary. I've been blessed to know Jim and Lynn Klein for 45 years, and they are extraordinary. And no wonder they are also connected to the most extraordinary human being I may have ever met, Gerda Weissman Klein. And We are here today because of her inspiration. She has inspired many people around the globe, speaking out on her history, advocating for democracy and citizenship, showing up in Columbine, teaching children, teenagers, how to get past tragedy. So it's with her blessing, the blessing of knowing Gerda Weissman Klein, that I invite up my friend, Jimmy Klein, as she called him, to introduce our first speaker.
So our family is far flung across the United States, so I know they're watching live on Zoom, and so I want to, on behalf of my sister and brother-in-law Vivian and Jim Ullman, and my sister and brother-in-law Leslie and Roger Simon, and Lynn and me, and all of the nieces and nephews, just really want to thank you, Evan, for putting this together. I think you know how much Mom admired you and how fond she was of you. And I should also add that this past summer, Evan and Jody and our friends Ray and Barbara Scherbel accompanied us on a trip to Germany, where my dad's hometown did a weekend of celebrations in his honor. So in the course of about 9 months or so, Evan has taken upon himself to help in honoring both of my parents. And needless to say, it was a very special moment in our family's life when Evan led us in reciting Kaddish at the graves of my great-grandparents in Germany. So before I get on to the substance, I just want to say a couple of words about this weekend, if I may. Yesterday, Rabbi Paley's Devar Torah spoke about Maimonides' interpretation of Aristotle in terms of teaching us that there are 3 types of friends in the world. There's a useful friend, a pleasant friend, and a friend who instructs us and inspires us ethically. And I was talking with Ray, we were remarking afterward. In fact, I'm going to do what Rabbi Paley taught us to do, which is to look straight into your eyes. For those of you who were here yesterday, come up to me and tell you that Ray and I were saying that you, Evan, embody all 3 of those types of friends. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that this whole weekend, and in fact the whole concept of the Jewish studio, are manifestations of this. I mean, usefulness, purpose. You decided to take this milestone birthday in your life and not make it a celebration about yourself, but rather to enrich the lives of our community. Enjoyment, I can't think of a more fun evening than it was last night at the winery and the unbelievable music that was played there. And of course, the rest of the weekend, this morning, is about the 3rd aspect of it, teaching us and inspiring us. So you follow in the footsteps of Aristotle. So several months ago, I can't even remember whether it was shortly before or shortly after Mom passed away, I spoke to Evan about this idea that I had about a program that really was inspired by Mom that would look at some of these issues related to the role of Jewish collaborators with the Nazis. And of course, in Evan's classic fashion, he took this on as a project all on his own, and he called me up a couple of months later and asked would it be okay if he sort of conceptualized what could be done with this and could he incorporate it into this remarkable weekend. And he really took it from there, and I was totally uninvolved other than sort of that initial conversation. And so naturally he decided to find an eminent Holocaust scholar who could address this topic, and very quickly, not surprisingly, his search landed upon Rabbi Michael Berenbaum, a incredibly eminent scholar, and I will just mention a few of his many distinguished accomplishments. He's the director of the Siggy Zierling Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at the American Jewish University, where he's also on the faculty. He's the author of more than 20 books and literally hundreds of scholarly articles and other op-eds and columns and papers all around the world. He was president of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation and also director of the U.S. Holocaust Research Institute at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. What Evan didn't know when he reached out to Rabbi Berenbaum is that Michael is a dear, close family friend of ours. And my mom loved Michael. And my parents greatly admired what he has devoted so much of his career, which obviously was something that meant a great deal to them, to say nothing just of the lovely friendship that they enjoyed with Michael and his lovely wife, Melissa. So it would mean so much to Mom to know that this day was put together by a friend that she loved, Evan, and the speaker that she loved, Michael Berenbaum, who, as a display of his friendship, took the red eye from California last night and just arrived here in town about 2 hours ago. But before I turn it over to Michael, I just want to set the stage for this, if I may. In the 1940s, there was a man named Moses Marin, who was the head of the Jewish Council for the region in Poland where my mother and about 100,000 other Jews lived. And in this capacity, he was sort of an intermediary, if you will, between the Nazis and the Jewish community. And he was a rather unsavory person, if what I've read can be believed. He would extract large bribes from people by promising them that he would get them out of forced labor. He collaborated with the Nazis to hunt down Jewish resistance fighters, and he coordinated the deportations to the camps of the people who lived within this region. And just two quotes that I'll share with you from him will give you a flavor of the kind of person that he was. In one speech, he said, "I will not be afraid to sacrifice 50,000 of our community in order to save the other 50,000. Then at last will my fame spread throughout the whole Jewish world. In Palestine, the new homeland, I shall be received in triumph. Only then shall I appear in my full glory." As my father, in his typical understated way, would have noted, Marin didn't suffer from false modesty. In a speech that he gave denouncing the Jewish resistance organizations, he said, "I warn you, I stand in a cage before a hungry and angry tiger. I stuff his mouth with meat, the flesh of my brothers and sisters, to keep him in his cage, lest he break loose and tear us all to bits. Oh, would the day come when you will be in the position to judge me. Let history pass sentence upon me." So my mom had her own personal interaction with Moses Marin, specifically on June 29th, 1942, the day that she and her mother and the rest of the remnants of the Jewish community in Belitz were being deported. And she wrote about him in her autobiography, All About My Life. And I want to just read a few relevant pages. I had not actually remembered how extensively she talked about it, so I will not read the whole thing, but just a few parts of it that are perhaps insightful in setting this up. So on this day, my mother and grandmother and the other Jews, they were marched into town, to a large field by the train station. And were waiting there to await their fate. They had no idea where they were being sent. Ultimately, my grandmother was put on a train and sent to Auschwitz, where she was killed the next day. My mother and the other sort of younger women and girls were put on a truck and taken in the first stage of their time spent in a series of slave labor and concentration camps. So my mom writes in the book, which was published in 1957, when they arrived, she said, "From mouth to mouth the news traveled. Marin was here. The king of the Jews, as he was called, had arrived. It was said that Marin lived in luxury, that he had visited Goebbels, that he was the only Jew to own a car, that he was indescribably wealthy. I imagine these things were true. Certainly he was master of life and death. I looked at him now. He was short, perhaps a bit over 5 feet, pale and thin. He had watery eyes, dull brown hair, and he was clad in a brown raincoat. He talked in a hoarse whisper. He pulled a bottle of schnapps from his pocket, drank first, and then handed it to the SS men about him. They drank after him. I saw it all and marveled. Yes, he was all right for them. He was their kind." A little bit further down, she writes, "Marin was walking in our direction. Mama prompted me, go ask him if we're going to Wadowice. So I asked him. He looked at me, his eyes without expression. Are you crazy, was his hoarse reply. A little bit later, they further march on, and as I say, my grandmother is taken to one side, my mother taken to the other side with some other young women and girls, and the following thing happens. We had assumed all along that we were going on a train, but now a truck came for us. I was the last one to enter it. Then I screamed, I want to go to my mother, and I jumped down. Just then, Marin passed. He looked at me, and with strength unsuspected in that little man, he picked me up and threw me back on the truck. You are too young to die, he said tonelessly. I glared at him. I hate you, I screamed. I hate you. His eyes were without expression. There was a faint smile on his pale, thin lips. It would have been easy for him to order me down and send me with my mother. Why did he not? Strange that the man who sent my mother to death had pushed me into the arms of life. So this was 1942. The book was published in 1957. In 2019, at age 95, my mother wrote an afterword to her book. And I think it's great. She deals with a lot of interesting experiences that she had after the war, as well as her further reflections on the experiences there and the people that she encountered. And she references Marin. And I'll just read you 2 pieces from it before handing it over here to our speaker. Mom writes, this is sort of when she's about 90 years old, or reflecting on when she was about 90 years old. A few years ago, I was sitting in my comfortable home, looking at a picture that had recently been taken at a family occasion. Counting children and grandchildren, spouses and great-grandchildren, we numbered more than 30. I reveled in the joy of the love that has been bestowed on me and reflected on what and to whom did I owe that good fortune. And the answer came to me as quite a shock. Marin. There's no denying that I, too, would have been murdered had he allowed me to run toward my mother. Of course, during the Holocaust, there were many events and circumstances, primarily luck, that intervened to save my life. But Marin's incredible action is one of them. The role he played, therefore, in making possible all the good things that have happened to me in the subsequent years cannot be dismissed. It is an enduring lesson to withhold judgment of someone until you have been confronted by the same choices, sometimes life and death decisions, that they have faced. Shortly before my mom died, she said she wanted the story of Marin to be told, and that's certainly not the whole story about him, and that she wanted it to be used as sort of a jumping-off point for a wider examination of the kinds of difficult ethical dilemmas and choices that emerged from the circumstances of that time. And there is no better person to lead us in that examination and discussion than Rabbi Professor Michael Berenbaum.
First of all, I'm humbled and I'm honored to be here. Let me say a couple of things. Thank you, Jimmy, okay? Let me say a couple of things before we begin. I knew Gerda for about 50 years, and I want to introduce a character. There's a beautiful legend about the founding of the temple in Jerusalem. And the final line of that legend is Chesed ve'emet nashaku. Grace and truth embraced. And those are characteristics, and when I think of that line, I think of Gerda, who had the combination of grace and then the truth-telling in all of its dimensions. Tonight is also the Academy Awards, and one of the privileges I had was to be a co-producer of One Survivor Remembers. And I said of that, without modesty, that it took no talent, it merely took the recognition of talent and getting out of the way. And that is, once you put Gerda in front of the camera, all you had to do was to make sure you didn't screw it up, and you let it happen. She gave a speech that night that ironically is immortalized, and you haven't seen it because you haven't been out to LA, but it's in the Academy Museum. And the speech that night is something that says something characteristic of then and now. We won the Academy Award for that. And Carrie Ann Tolis did something against, who was the director and producer, did something against all instructions. And that is, he brought Gerda up to accept the Academy Award. She went to the microphone, and they were about to play music to get her off because the Academy Awards has a 2-minute time limit. And the person in charge of control was a child of survivors. And he said, to quote him, and you'll forgive the language, "Screw that. I'm at the controls, this is going to happen." And she said, "I come from a place where the most glorious luxury imaginable was a boring evening at home." So all of you who have the joy, the privilege, the honor to go back to a boring evening at home, you're all winners. And the place erupted. And if you think of the characteristics of the world, boring would be marvelous. And who but Gerda could present boring as a moment of glory and triumph? And if you think of it as a comment on our world, would that it were boring. Would that it were boring. So I want you to think of the term chesed ve'emet nashaku. Grace and truth embraced in one person, actually in two people who became a combination of both, of one. They embraced, and we are the beneficiaries of it. And that's Gerda, and that's Kurt. And again, you have to imagine we use that as the concluding moment of the seeing the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And just let me tell one more story, which is that the goddess of documentary filmmakers, Sheila Nevins, walked through the museum and saw that final moment of Kurt and Gerda telling the story. And on the way home, her son asked her if she would buy him a Jewish star. And remember, Union Station used to have jewelry. I don't know what it is today, but used to have jewelry stores. She walked in and she got a Jewish star. And then the next morning, she called me at about 7:30 in the morning. I got to do a film. And when Sheila Nevins wanted to do a film, you didn't stand in her way. You just said, and that's the origin of One Survivor Remembers, in which she took Gerda's testimony with interspersing Kurt, and essentially we got out of the way. And if you ever see the film, and you should see the film, one of the ways of getting out of the way also was an incredible thing, a decision of the director when they were leaving on that truck. He did something, he gave us glimpses of what they were seeing, but you can't see the downtown. But what doesn't change in a town, especially a European town? The rooftops. So you are coming away from downtown and you're seeing the edges of the rooftops, exactly what they would have seen as they were leaving home. And it's one of the examples of the way in which we got out of the way and just triggered enough there. Let me introduce you to two pieces of vocabulary and then talk a little bit about it. And let me also say something else. There were honor trials in Israel of Jews who had collaborated with the Nazis, and the honor trials were sealed for 70 years. And they are now becoming unsealed. And I'm working with a graduate student whose Hebrew is absolutely fluent because they wanted 70 years to go by before we understood what the judgments were made in the immediate years afterwards. How did these judgments come about? Somebody was walking down the street and they saw somebody whom they recognized who had done something ignoble, and they decided to take action. Sometimes there were scuffles, sometimes there were screams and shouts and physical violence, but sometimes they brought them to judgment. And we're going to now understand what the judgment was in 1947, 48, and 49, and 50 as this becomes unsealed and as people begin to go through these records. So we're going to know an awful lot more very soon. Let's talk about language for a moment, because you need words to be able to begin to describe this. First language I want to introduce you is in Holocaust, we have a term, in Holocaust studies, we have a term called the gray zone. And that is, if you presume that, and one of the things you have to understand is you've all seen the Holocaust primarily in black and white. In fact, the images we have, the films that we have, the sense of it is it's all black and white. We also think of the killers as black, dark, evil, and believe me, the evil is evil incarnate in a very dramatic way. But in another way, we think of the victims as uncompromised innocents. And what we've discovered that we have to talk about very often is the gray zone, the in-between. And every survivor remembers a moment when they traverse that gray zone. And Gerda, in her testimony, does something very incredible, which is she remembers a moment, Frau Klugler, a woman who looked like a bulldog, she said, who picked her up when she was sick and said, get in front of the looms today, this is life and death. And she taught her what? Something incredible. She taught her that not all Germans were evil. She also taught us something else, which is even in the worst of circumstances with the most difficult tasks involved, a human being had the capacity to do something that what? saved a life, and moved into that gray zone. You couldn't put her as descriptive only in black. So we have the gray zone as a vocabulary, and the other vocabulary that was introduced is a vocabulary that I want us to become understanding and struggling with and wrestling with. And that is a concept introduced by a very great literary scholar, a man by the name of Lawrence Langer. And Lawrence, and I see you know the language very well. Lawrence Langer, let me just tell one story. Lawrence Langer is still working productively. There's a film coming out on PBS on his work at 95. He's in his 11th decade, and he's still writing. And the joke we have is Lawrence Langer retired 33 years ago, and nobody never noticed that he retired. Not him, not any of us. And he introduced a very important concept called choiceless choice. Choiceless choice means that we don't have a situation in which we can choose between good and bad, or even good and even between bad and less bad. But we essentially have a situation in which you face a choice that is between the impossible, the unimaginable, the most awful, and the equally most awful. The example he gives is a very interesting and painful example, and if you study the Holocaust, you have to be graphic in understanding this. A woman arrives in Auschwitz, and she is pregnant. She gives birth. The women in the barracks cuddle the baby, and they touch, and I want to use this in a non-political sense, they touch something that you couldn't imagine in Auschwitz. They touch both innocent life and something absolutely precious and delicate. And nobody any longer had any measure of innocence and any measure of delicacy. Happens in the barracks for a little while. And then one woman takes the infant, puts the infant in a little bowl of water, and the infant is killed. Everything within you wants to scream what? This is infanticide. This is murder. This is the most awful thing imaginable. But it was also rescue. That's what Langer means when he speaks of choiceless choices. Infanticide, which is also rescue. And anybody who's worked with the literature on the situation involved understands what that is. Let's look at the phenomenon. I'm going to deal with 3 cases for a moment. Not for a moment, but for a brief period of time. Let's look at the phenomenon of Meron, but let's look at the archetypes. There are 2 archetypes. One is the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto, Adam Chernyakov, and the other is the leader of the Lodz Ghetto, Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski. Rumkowski shared something, your term from Kurt, of somebody who didn't suffer from immodesty. Rumkowski was the leader of the Lodz Ghetto, and he had his picture on the currency that was used in the ghetto. And he also, in addition to having his picture on the currency that was used in the ghetto, he even insisted on officiating at marriages and everything else. He controlled the ghetto, and the ghetto was different than Warsaw in the sense that it was enormously isolated and was surrounded by barbed wire, but Warsaw had 2 great advantages that don't sound like advantages, but they are advantages. Number 1, it was located in the center of the city, and they couldn't disconnect the sewer system. And because they couldn't and the sewer system, I don't know if you know the design of sewer system, but sewer system works on a principle of gravity. And you can't get rid of gravity if you're going to deal with any city of any consequences. So in order to smuggle, for example, you needed little children, and Ringelblum says that if you erected a statue to hero of the Warsaw Ghetto, it wouldn't be the resistance fighters, it would be the 10-year-old kids who could stand up in the sewers and who smuggled food into the sewers. Chernyakov, in a very real sense, ran what we would call laissez-faire capitalism. He was essentially the mayor of a city that was deeply surrounded, 11 feet high walls surrounded the entire ghetto. He was responsible for all the things that a mayor would be responsible: healthcare, sewage, sanitation, food, jobs, etc. And the most remarkable thing is he left us an enormous diary. Day by day by day, he wrote down what he was doing in the situation that he was facing. He decided that the only way he could control was, ironically, not to control, to let things happen. There came a moment, and what was the fight with resistance? And let's talk about resistance for a moment. There are essentially, when we use resistance, I'm going to define resistance. There were 3 forms of nonviolent resistance, and then 1 form of violent resistance, which was an armed uprising. Nonviolent resistance included what we call polemical resistance. That's resistance in words, in deeds, documenting it. Ringelblum, writing his archive, is polemical resistance. Graffiti is polemical resistance, and underground newspaper is polemical resistance. Even humor is polemical resistance. And let me tell you one joke from the Warsaw Ghetto. A young boy is asked, 12-year-old boy is asked, what would you like most of all if you were Hitler's son? He said, Ich will sein Yosem. I'd like to be an orphan. And what is he able to do with that humor? He's able to murder Hitler symbolically, and he's also enable us what? To release all the energy that the oppressed release with being able to laugh at the horror of their condition. Polemical resistance. The second form of resistance is what we call symbolic resistance. Symbolic resistance can take many forms. It's cultural events in the ghetto which raise morale. Symbolic resistance can be something that happened in the Theresienstadt ghetto. They performed something unimaginable. They performed Verdi's Requiem, presuming that they could Jewish choir and orchestra with a non-tuned piano done by a world-class conductors performing Verdi's Requiem for the Nazis to almost embarrass them, not with success. Symbolic resistance is teaching children, believing that you have to prepare them for tomorrow, even for tomorrow they will not live to see. Symbolic resistance is the person who washed in the death camp, even though he couldn't get clean, to remember that every day he used to put on clean underwear when he lived in a normal place. So that was another form of resistance. The last form of resistance that we have before armed resistance is self-help. And that is, there were soup kitchens in the Warsaw Ghetto, soup kitchens elsewhere. There were charity drives. Jews helped Jews. By the way, one of the most painful documents is to read somebody writing about her work in the soup kitchen who says, I'm not sure we did any good. We may have merely prolonged death and dying because we can't feed people. By the way, so in that sense, what was the danger for Chernyakov and for Marin of armed uprising? Armed uprising only occurred when you fully understood what was about to happen. You understood you were going to die or you were dead, and that gave you the freedom to do anything imaginable. I gave a lecture once and I said resistance was a way, was a statement of what to do with the fact that you're dead. And I was corrected by a man by the name of Marek Edelman, who was the last surviving commander of the Warsaw Ghetto, who screamed at me. And he said, no, you don't understand. All of a sudden, we were the only people who could live as free because we already were dead. It was the way to live until you died. Chernyakov's goal, Marin's goal, Rumkovsky's goal was to keep the ghetto alive. And what? And therefore, if the resistance, armed resistance, was the last stand, they were actually the enemy. And the most greatest failure that all of these Judenrats had was they did not have an intelligence network. And, you know, think of the role of the Mossad in keeping Israel safe. Now, what happened? What did the resistance do in Warsaw before? It sent a man by the name of Zygmunt Freilich, who had been a union organizer. It sent him on a train to a place called Malkinia, which is the anteroom to Treblinka. He arrived there and he asked what's happening. He said, trains are coming in every day. They're coming in full. They're going back empty. No food has been delivered to the camp and no wells have been dug, and it's eerily quiet at night. We now know how to piece that together. He didn't know how to piece that together. He said, how do I know what's happening there? They said, take a deep breath. And the smell of human flesh has a smell that's uniquely and peculiarly its own. And some people also said they smelled it again after 9/11 in New York. So from their perspective, resistance was from the enemy because they thought they were keeping the ghetto alive. Chernyakov had a moment in which he turned, even for the resistance, from villain into a gray zone. He tried with all of his energy to keep the children alive, and the Nazis kept deceiving him, and then they asked him to sign the decree that led to the deportation. And between the 23rd of July and the 21st of September, 265,000 Jews were shipped by train to Treblinka. Put it in Jewish terms, that's literally between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. 265,000 people done. He gets this order. He writes a note to his wife. He writes in his diary, and I was with the great scholar Raoul Hilberg when we held the diary for the first time. He had finished book 9 of his diary. And were he to be alive the next day, he would have to begin book 10. He writes, they've asked me to kill the children with my own hands. This I cannot do. And he swallows cyanide and dies. And the decree comes out without a signature. And Rumkovsky, as it were, recovers his name. Ringelblum is critical. Ringelblum says, a coward, he should have called for resistance. But that's the moment of futility. Let's look at Rumkovsky. And Rumkovsky offers a thoroughly different picture. Rumkovsky was not laissez-faire capitalism. Rumkovsky ran the ghetto as if it was a controlled economy, and he wanted to control everything. He wanted to control the supply of food. He wanted to control all the businesses, wanted to control all of the factories, wanted to control everything. And he developed an interesting strategy. A strategy that would seem to make sense. What was his strategy? I'm going to produce goods for the Wehrmacht, the German army, on time, under budget, and I'm going to bribe my handler and his handler so that the Wehrmacht is going to be interested in keeping the ghetto alive, and my handler is going to be interested in keeping the ghetto alive because people don't like to shut down what? The source of their income. And his handler is going to be interested in keeping the ghetto alive. To do that, I have to do something enormously difficult. And he gave what can be clearly, in retrospect, understood as the worst speech in Jewish history. He said, "A broken man stands before you. I cannot save everyone, but I can save some. So, brothers and sisters, give me your children." And what does he do? In order to create a working camp, a slave labor camp that's working at enormous productivity, he presides over a deportation. Remember, he doesn't kill. He presides over the deportation of the old who are incapable of working and of children who are not yet capable of working, of what one would call technically surplus population. He doesn't do this with joy. He doesn't do it. He said, I have been devoted my life to taking care of orphans. A broken man stands before you. Paradox. The Lodz ghetto is the last ghetto in Poland to be destroyed. When every other ghetto was destroyed in 1942 and 43, the Lodz ghetto was alive until August 1944. Rumkowski, when they've come to the final deportation, Rumkowski is deported along with the Lodz ghetto. And the very interesting thing, there are 3 different accounts of how Rumkowski died, and I've heard all 3 accounts from survivors who say I was there. Which tells me, and some of you were probably psychiatrists here, which tells me that they may be more reflective of how they wish Rumkowski had died than how Rumkowski had died. Version 1. Rumkowski boards the train. He's an old man like every other old man. He arrives at Auschwitz. He's selected to die. Version 2. Rumkowski boards the train, and the Jews themselves kill him. Version 3, he comes to Auschwitz with a letter from his handler, Hans Bibel, and the letter indicates that he's entitled to special treatment. He's greeted at the edge of Auschwitz with a limousine. This is a little bit of an exaggeration. There were no limousines at Auschwitz. He's greeted at Auschwitz with a limousine, and he's taken directly to the gas chambers. Meaning that as he deceived, he was deceived. What do historians have to say now as we look at, again, the worst speech in Jewish history? I don't know, maybe Michael Paley does. I don't know of any other speech in Jewish history in which somebody says, brothers and sisters, give me your children. Right? Normal life is, what do? Men, women and children first, and the men are the last, right? If you have the boats, the lifeboats of the Titanic. The Russians had conquered most of Poland by the summer of 1944. The Russians were within 120 kilometers of Lodz. And even by the time they were deported, they had even liberated the death camp of Majdanek. had they turned a little bit in a southerly direction, Rumkowski would have ended up presiding and having a significant percentage of the population of his ghetto survive. And the question then goes is, would he have gone down in Jewish history as a hero? Would he have gone down in Jewish history as a villain? Or would we be faced with the enormous paradox of what? He's both. He's both. And that has to say one thing to us that's very important. And the one thing that's very important to us is that they were dealing with almost what we can only imagine as choiceless choices. Now, other heads of Jewish council did a couple of things, and we have to present the other alternative. Asked to present the list for deportation. One head of the Yudenrat put his name down in the name of his own family, and nothing else. You have a case of the father of the chief rabbi, former chief rabbi of Israel, the grandfather of the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Lau is the chief rabbi, but that's the Israel name, Rabbi Levi, who essentially is the rabbi of Pietrikov. And when they come to round up the Jews, he sends his own family into hiding, but he will not go and hide. Why will he not go and hide? Because he's prominent and he understands that if he goes and hides, then they will spend a lot of time searching for him and they will find other Jews. He said, I have the right to save my family, but I don't have the right to cause any other Jew to be killed. And he stands in his rabbinic garb in front of the synagogue and essentially says, come and arrest me, I'm here. Other choices could have been made. Chernyakov made one choice, Rumkowski made another choice. Remember, gray zone, choiceless choices. Let me talk about two other cases very quickly. There were a group of Jews who worked in the vicinity of the gas chambers. They were called Sonderkommando. They were intimate with the act of death. They never killed anyone, but they were the people who were in the undressing room before the Jews were killed, and they were the people in the who took the bodies out and put them into the flames and burned them. They ironically became taboo. They became taboo to the Nazis as well. They lived above the crematoria, and they ironically therefore had heat in the winter. Heat in the summer as well, ironically, but they had heat in the winter. And they also were well fed because they had, ironically, they were well fed because they ironically were able to gather the food that the people had brought with them who were taken to the gas chamber. So when the Greeks were taken, they ate olives. And when other people were taken, they ate the foods of those countries, however meager. And essentially, they were thoroughly, and they were to be killed at the end of 90 days because they had seen it all. When did the uprising break out? The uprising broke out in Auschwitz on October 7th, 1944, and broke out in Treblinka on August 4th, 1943. It broke out in Sobibor in November of 1944. November of 1943. And the irony, of course, is it broke out precisely as the business of killing was slowing down because they understood that they were the next to die. The Nazis themselves, ironically, only did the killing. The gas arrived, and this is a very specific detail, the gas arrived in a Red Cross truck. Not a real Red Cross truck, but a truck that was painted with a Red Cross. Why was it painted with a Red Cross? Because it was part of the deception. If you see the Red Cross, what do you feel? You feel that safety and help is about to come your way. You feel what? Goodness is about to happen. They built a very interesting modality of killing because crematoria B2 and B3, the large crematoria at Auschwitz that could hold 2,000 people at a time, were misdesigned. What do I mean misdesigned? The gas was put in on top, but you know that gas rises. Putting it on top is not the smartest way of doing it. The other gas chambers have them at the bottom. So they designed a double-edged cage in which they lowered the gas on strings in a basket, and it couldn't be touched. They left it in there for 20 or 30 minutes, and then they what? They lifted the gas up, they lifted it out, and this was only done by Nazis, and a physician stood by to sign, as it were, the death certificate to pronounce the dead dead. Then the Sonderkommando came to work, and when the Sonderkommando came to work, they burned the bodies. And there's a description of one man who took it upon himself to only bring children to the crematoria. And on each child he brought there, he said the Kel Malei Rachamim and the Kaddish. Now you have to ask yourself, what could these people do? And if you read them, you read that they describe themselves in ways that they describe themselves as robots and automatons. Robots and automatons because they had to close off to all feeling. And the most poignant testimony is given when one man says of himself, he said, "Only when I heard a child say, 'Mommy, it's cold,' haven't I been good, did I begin to cry. Later I had no feeling." So how are we to judge them? Some judge them as the enablers of the death process because the Nazis did not have to do most of it themselves. They only reserved to themselves the killing part of it. And by the way, there was an orchestra that played on as they were bringing the bodies out. What about the orchestra? How are we to judge them? Let's take the last case very quickly. The last case is the case that became enormously controversial in Israel in the 1950s. It was the case of Israel Rezo Kastner. Kastner was a Zionist leader operating in Budapest, and it's still controversial today in Budapest. Still what? Less, but still controversial in Budapest. And Kastner negotiated directly with Eichmann. One of the reasons Eichmann became as well known was he was one of the very few high-ranking Nazi officials that people actually saw directly and had physical contact with. Had contact with him in Vienna, had contact with him in Budapest, had contact with him in the various countries in which he worked, and therefore the name Eichmann was known, the face was known, and the direct contact. Kastner negotiated with Eichmann and with also a subordinate of Eichmann. This is in 1944 when the war is winding down, when everybody knows the Germans are going to lose, and the only issue is when they're going to lose and how many Jews will be killed before then. And they had just deported 437,402 Hungarian Jews on 147 trains in 54 days, primarily to Auschwitz. And if you look at Auschwitz, at Birkenau, you see that there are 3 tracks on the inside of the camp. If you ever visit the camp, there are 3 tracks. Those tracts came in February 1944. And they came in essentially because they were preparing for Hungarian Jews. 437,402 Jews on 147 trains over 54 days means that there are 2.7 trains arriving a day, which is why you needed 3 tracks. 2,950 Jews a train. Kostner negotiates 1 train is going to go to Switzerland. He chooses a variety of people, including some very wealthy people who then are able to give money over to be able to provide resources for the remaining Jews. And he essentially chooses his in-laws, but not himself. And this group ends up in Switzerland. They end up first in Bergen-Belsen. They're kept separately in Bergen-Belsen. They end up in Switzerland. And he does one more thing that is enormously controversial, which is he testifies after the war at the post-Nuremberg trials for one of the officials by the name of Brecher. He testifies at the trial of Brecher, trying to say that he was a little bit different. He helped get people out. And there's substantial evidence that one of the things Brecher had was all of the money that had been confiscated from Hungarian Jews, and that one of the people who wanted to get that money back in exchange for all of this was David Ben-Gurion, who had a state to finance that had no resources. So the question is the gray zone of David Ben-Gurion, and also the gray zone of what? Of Kostner. What's the story with Kostner? He comes to a libel trial because somebody says that he's collaborated with the devil, and people accuse him of not telling what had happened. And then after he's found guilty of, they find that he was defamed, but they give him no monetary compensation for it. And the judge, who is one of the judges, ironically later of the Achman trial, says he negotiated with the devil. He sold his soul to the devil. He then is assassinated. Ironically, the Israel Supreme Court then overturns the verdict. And the debate of whether Kostner is responsible or not, Kostner, on the one hand, is said that he didn't warn the Hungarian Jews of what was happening in Auschwitz. And therefore, they went to the trains not knowing. And lots of Hungarian Jews testified at Auschwitz, we did not know the name. You see that in Wiesel's book, for example. On the other hand, Kostner saved more Jews than Schindler. So the question, is he a hero? Is he a villain? Is he both? And part of what we have to wrestle with is, what is the legacy? And one of the things that I want you to, and with this I'll conclude, is you have to ask 4 questions. I guess we're in preparation for Pesach. The first question you have to ask is, number 1, they could not, who was negotiating with whom and what power did they have? When you went in to negotiate with Eichmann and you were in Budapest in 1944, he had all the power, you had none. You had to lie a little bit to Eichmann. You had to sometimes pretend that Jews were much more powerful, much more wealthy, much more available than anybody else, than even he imagined. Number 2, what did they know? And when did they know it? Now, in every case of resistance that we know of, they knew absolutely clearly that the ghetto was doomed to die. In the camps, they knew absolutely clearly that they were doomed to die. That resistance was not an early response, it was a later response, and historians distinguish between information and knowledge. You can have lots of rumors, but only when the rumors really become confirmed and internalized do they become knowledge. And only then do you understand how stark your alternatives are. The third question is, what alternatives did they have? And the fourth is, we can't use ordinary means of judgment because the circumstances were beyond dire. We don't have a vocabulary by which to articulate that. So let me conclude by reminding you, choiceless choices, the gray zone. And remind you also that we are now about to have, and this will be an important couple of books that will come out in 3 to 4 years. We're about to understand how in 1950, so close to the event, people judged how other Jews behaved in the 1940s in the midst of the Shoah. The results may not be pretty, but they may be enormously instructive. And last point, I want you to remember one more phrase that will help you understand a little bit about the circumstances. Just because Jews were powerless does not mean they were passive. How you behaved with your abject powerlessness becomes the way in which we struggle to understand the level of the gray zone. And even within the gray zone, there were bad people. Let's assume Marin, who had moments in which they did wonderful things. And look at the glory of you and your family, your mother and your father, and their life. Bad people can accidentally or deliberately do good things. That doesn't erase their badness, but it says that you got to try to figure out when you can somehow deal with the goodness of the bad. Thank you.
So these are words of Abraham Joshua Heschel about 10 years before the war, kind of prescient, because he asks, he's already seeing the seeds of what's happening. And he says, haven't the prayers of generations and generations even moved you just even an inch? You know, so we're talking about like this faith that all the Jews had. And he's like, we are always praying for your forgiveness. You have to pray for our forgiveness. And this is a piece that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote before the war called Shuvah. Haben vielleicht denn von deines, dein Rachman ist nicht der Greich. Messias Nafsch und es Lavus, unser Tschuka nicht erzählt. Gott, du gräster Schwäger, entfrist rettende Schäufschrei. Du bist Verbrecher, nicht kein Saneger, sagst der Sinne nicht vergangen. Nur Thermal trifft wie Trär a Regen, sagst das Sinne in dem Welt. Zoals is Tick verlegen, Gott sich und zertwegen, doch unser weitig Mond der Barim, gib Schattern, touch, dat Charate Hilf. Jede Hoffnung soll befällt dir sein, in jeder Scheu der an Allah.
Gott und Mensch und Hint, lass mir Tshuva tun zusammen. Unser Eder fahr dem Zweiten, hat der eine fahr dem Zweiten. Und vergeb uns unser Sinn, azoi wie mir vergeben deine. Und vergeb uns unser Sinn, azoi wie mir
This is a folk song of the Hungarian Jewish community. And it's a folk song. It was initially simply a Hungarian folk song, but the story goes that of a Hasidic Rebbe who heard the song being sung by a shepherd, learned the song from the shepherd, brought it to his Hasidim. And this song, which speaks of, I'll share the words in English. The rooster is crowing. Soon it will be daylight. In a green forest and a smooth meadow, a bird is strolling. What kind of bird? Its feet are yellow, its wings are blue. It's waiting for me. Wait, bird, wait. Wait for me. If God's ordered me to come to you, I will be yours. And this became a song of redemption and the image of the Jews as a bird, as a wandering bird, and redemption as elusive. He added a verse in Hebrew for the time of redemption. Solo kakashmar. Sol ha-kakoshmar, meg me vir jodmar, zul der döben, shik me zöben, shitoler modar, zul der döben, Shik me seven, shitoler modar, michoda madar, michoda madar, shargolavo kika sanyo engemando. Sharkolabo kiken sanyo engemadovat. Var modar var techok min dikbar az iständig kedrendelt Tielesek mar az Isten nikerentelt Tielesek mar. When מכל הזמן, מכל הזמן, יבונה המקדושי, עיר ציון תמלא, הכל הזמן, יבונה המקדושי, עיר ציון תמלא, הכל הזמן. I wanted to share in this question of so many roles that music played. When I was in my previous life, I worked on the film The Pianist, and while I was preparing for the role in the film, there was an ethnomusicologist who made me an album. It was actually a mixtape. It was a cassette tape of all the music that this young woman would have been listening to. From can you hear me? Sorry. You knocked the breath out of many of us. And there was so much music, so many different influences, so much life on this mixtape, from chazanis to the comedian harmonists, to all so much. And we wanted to end our singing today with a particular song of hope, of Shoilem. The music, can you say a moment, can you say something about the melody? Adrian.
Well, I know that the person that I learned it from was this incredible Yiddishist named Adrian Cooper. And she worked in YIVO, and she was responsible for keeping alive and bringing out so many melodies and so many songs. And she used this as a protest song, and she would sing this with every part of her kishkas. And she felt it, and she meant it, and she was an activist. She died young. And so many people right now in New York who are in the Yiddish singing community are in her legacy and keeping her legacy alive. And we are now in that stream, and we are hoping to bring her spirit right here and the spirit of our generations past.
Amen. And bringing the music for life, because so often with Shoah, much of the music it is bringing us into death, and it is taking us to the place of grief and the place of mourning, and also to remember this is living music, this is vibrant, breathing music, and sometimes only music can take us there.
Yeah, and strength, let's bring it to the streets, and let's bring peace.
And if you know, please sing along with us. Wollte gehabt koye, wollte gelaufen in Gassen, wollten ich kriegen Scheulem, 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 Scheulem.
Wollte gehabt koye,
koye,
gelaufen in die
wollte gelaufen in Gassen, wollte geschrien, Scheulem, Scheulem, Scheulem. Ya la la ya la la, ya la la ya la la, ya 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 la yo la la ya mama, ay, ya 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 la lo, ya 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 la lo, ya ya ma la yo.
The story doesn't end in Treblinka. Our story does not end at Auschwitz. Their story does not end. The Jewish people did not come to an end. In 70 years, some of us make a life. Some of us change the lives of others. Our next speaker has been one of those people who has been influential in untold numbers of lives, a teacher of leaders, a person who has changed the way the Jewish community in its corporate structures relates to the larger world, to the Jewish world and the world beyond. An inspiration to so many, and the kind of person with whom, once you know him for a second, you're a friend of his for life. To tell us more about his journey over the last 5 years especially, leaving one of the most prestigious places in the Jewish world in New York to take on the task of shepherding the rebirth of Jewish life in Europe. I give you Rabbi Michael Paley.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm completely wiped out. Start off with the partisan song, and then choiceless choices in the gray zone, and then little kakashvar. Really, if you want to just rip my heart out and throw it on the floor, that's what happened. So, and I always love to talk just after my long friend, Michael Berenbaum, because, I forget what a fantastic speaker you are and how I want to actually try and kill myself at the end of, so in the face of all that, and of your wonderful mother, whom, I think she came to UJ Federation even. That was when I met her, and she also, I think I couldn't get up for like an hour afterwards. So here I am, just at the end, and doing this. And I actually had lots of beginning openings, and one of them is, I believe I'm here because Evan and Jody came to Budapest, and we walked around Budapest, and I told them the story of the revival of Jewish life in Budapest, which is quite extraordinary, and now I'm going to try and tell you that a little bit. And I'm also going to try and say a little bit about the revival of Jewish life in Europe. So 5 years ago, but really 10 years ago, I took a sabbatical, and I went to Europe. And I went in the search of an answer. I just want to reflect, because you did, and I'm a rabbi, so we have to say rabbi things, Mishnah, like Gemara. You have to start with the Gemara. So I studied Daf Yomi. I study the page of Talmud every day. And today, the page of Talmud, which is Nazir 48, in case you want to go and check it out, it's about the mitzvah of burying the dead, Meis mitzvah, right? And it asks the question, if you're the Kohen Gadol, if you're the high priest, and you're not allowed to go near a dead body, what do you have to do? Do you have to bury the body, even though you're the high priest? Or do you say, no, I'm the high priest, I'm above that. I'm not going to do that. Someone else will come. And the answer is, you have to bury the body, even if you're the high priest. So 10 years ago, I thought about this. I remember thinking to myself, why am I going to Budapest? And the reason that I thought about it is because every single person that I know said to me, why are you going to Budapest? Like, what is in Budapest? Why? You have a nice job and a nice family, live on the Upper West Side, and shut up, enjoy your life. You're lucky. Don't do anything. So, but no, Paley, my story, I'm always the kid that wandered off. And so I'm, if you were in my mother was in aisle 5, I was in aisle 7, or if she was on one side of the playground, I was on the other side of the playground. I was always, and she would, even at the end of her life, she would say, where's Michael? I don't know. He's wandering off somewhere. And that's it. So I went to Budapest, and another Jewish story comes to mind. So it's coming up Passover, yeah? Passover? The Haggadah. there is a story in the Haggadah which is very hard to explain, right? There are 5 rabbis, and they're sitting in Bnei Brak, right? And these rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Tarfon, are sitting around, and they are having a very long Seder, just the kind that my family actually hates, but that I like. And so we have that struggle going. And they say, the students all of a sudden come in and they say, rabbis, time to say the morning Shema. And that story gets prime time place in the Haggadah, right? Like 8 o'clock before the kids get nervous, and you get too hungry, and my grandmother starts to say, when do we eat? It's like and why? What's the story about? Really? It's hard to say, So what is the story about? So first of all, this is not just any Seder. This is the Dream Team Seder, right? These are the one-name rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, not like, which Rabbi Akiva? No, the real one, Rabbi Akiva, the Rabbi Tarfon, not Rabbi Tarfon, like, which one? The one that, no, the big one, The only one that gets the second name is Elazar ben Azariah because he's a kid, He hasn't grown up into becoming. So this is like, these are the guys that you want to go with. This is Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yeshua that were in Jerusalem and carried out the coffin filled with a living Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is going to come out and restore the Jewish people, right? And they sit around all night and they talk and they talk and they talk. And outside them, people are dying and they're being persecuted by the Romans. And yet, these 5 guys are planning the future. And they don't agree, right? We know what they all say. We know that one says we should fight and one says we should go and rebuild the temple and one says we should, all one after another. I won't go into that. Because the most important thing of that story, and right there in the Seder, I can almost see the people in the camps or in the ghettos reading that story and knowing what that story means and saying, we gotta survive here. We are the Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Yeshua, Rebbe Tarfon, Rebbe Akiva, and Elazar ben Azariah of today, right, in the 1930s and late 30s and 40s. And we're going to do it, right? We have to plan. And so here I am, In one way, I went to Europe 10 years ago to do Mace Mitzvah. Isn't that what we think about Europe? It's a graveyard, right? People would say, even I sometimes ask in the airport in Budapest, a lot of times I ask, there are Jews there, and I say, did you see the Jewish community? Yes, we went to the big empty synagogue, and did you go to we went and we saw the shoes on the Danube Memorial, and we saw the little golden shields on the streets, with the names of the people. We saw all that stuff. How many Jews do you think live in Budapest? I don't know, 500, 1,000, 700. How many Jews live there? I said, 150,000. 150,000 Jews live in Budapest, right? Maybe it's only 120,000. Maybe it's 130,000. But certainly more than 120,000 by all censuses. And one guy, Andras Kovac, thinks 200,000, And that's not even counting the people that don't even admit that they're Jewish for generations, right? That are practiced in not being Jewish, that have really, but also they're Jewish. They're just a different kind of Jew. Right? And I said, did you go see the 4-day schools? No, we didn't, right? And did you go see the 22 synagogues? Not the big one that you have to pay $25 to get in, but the other ones that are empty, you can just walk in by yourself, they're empty because it's not Shabbos, and maybe even on Shabbos they're kind of empty. Did you go to see the Jewish Community Center, which is pretty vibrant, and then you can't get in because it's almost always full? And did you go to see all of the other things in the city of Budapest where Jewish life is growing, right? And most of them say, no, we didn't do that. We came to go see the grave. We did not come to go see the life, So I'm enormously grateful for what you say, and I just can't get over even the Heschel. My God, I would probably remember you scream for the rest of my life. And fair enough, right? But I wanted to at least spend a few minutes on what's going on in Europe now. Good? I'm going to try and talk short, which is not my best thing, In fact, I probably fail again now, so we can have some questions. But I do want to I want to connect some dots for you before that. Good? All right. So in 1944, the alliance between Miklos Horthy and Hitler began to fall apart. Miklos Horthy was the regent. He was Admiral Horthy. Hard to know exactly why you need an admiral in landlocked Hungary, but anyways, that's what he was. And he told Hitler, "Don't kill the Jews yet because I need them for my economy." And so the Jews of Budapest lived on through 42, 43, and even the beginning of 44, in kind of, I don't know, bliss and they knew what was going on a bit, but not as much as you think, right? Not as much as you think. In fact, I even heard Elie Wiesel say once that his great anger was that the Americans didn't at least shout, that this Holocaust was going on, and they knew, so that they could run, right? People could have run. They really didn't know, right? Wiesel is a Hungarian Jew living in the Carpathian Mountains. Maybe he's Ukrainian, maybe he's Romanian, but he's really a Hungarian-speaking Jew, without question. And he and Renouf Braham, they all say most of the people just didn't know, right? So they stayed there, and then the alliance between Horthy and Hitler fell apart, and people like Kastner were outliers, but most of the people, as you say, 437,000 of the probably 650,000 Jews of Greater Hungary at the time were killed. You might be unsurprised to know that Kastner, who put a train, the only thing they're mad at him about is that he put the Satmar Rebbe on the train, and they're not mad that he took out mostly their grandparents on the train, because around 10,000 people in Budapest are now alive because of the Kastner train, and they do not find that paradoxical or even with an air of ambivalence. They just are happy that they're alive. The monuments in Budapest are ambivalent about him, but the people themselves, not so ambivalent. All right, so the only ghetto that was liberated but not liquidated in 1945 was the Budapest ghetto, and it's liberated by the Russians, right? And the Russians do it in a particularly brutal way, right? They don't just kind of come in and say, "All right, the war's over, welcome back." They really come in and they oppress, and particularly they oppress the Jewish community. So as it happens, when the next generation starts to be born almost right away, you would be out of your mind to tell your kids that you're Jewish, right? No one would, in their right mind, would say, "Hi, we've just had a wonderful half a decade, and now you're Jewish. I hope you're happy about it." No, everybody would say, "We're not Jewish," right? And they would try and seek to shrink into the background. So 45, 46, 47, 50, 55, 60, all the way until really 89, no one tells their kids that they're Jewish, because you'd be crazy, right? If your 5-year-old kid, goes to school and says, "Hey, I'm Jewish and I'd like to sing you Solish Kakashmar with the Yiboneh Beit HaMikdash in it," you may lose your job and your apartment, So that's the state of affairs in 1989. But with the fall of communism and the emergence of an independent Hungary and Poland and all these places, all of a sudden, two things could have happened. We could have said, "Oh, we're finally here to put a decent burial of European Jewry," or Judaism in Europe could revive, right? So that's what I went to go find out 10 years ago. And here's what I found out. Unlike America, where I grew up in Boston, lovely suburban Jewish kid, all those people in Budapest that I know can tell you the story of when they found out that they were Jewish, right? And the stories are kind of amazing, right? So one of my friends, Tommy Buchler, lovely guy, his brother Andras, part of the Jewish community. I said, "How did you find out you were Jewish?" He tells me, "My mother, my grandmother told my mother, Ava, that I'm dying, and just before I die, I want to tell you, you're Jewish, right? You're Jewish. Oh, but don't tell Janos. Don't tell Janos. Janos is an anti-Semite. We don't want to break up your marriage. He's a lovely guy. We like him a lot. He's a dentist. Don't tell Janos, right?" So she doesn't, right? I'm a Jew. Who knew, right? And then they're sitting at home and they're watching the movie Cabaret. Cabaret. There's a power-packed movie for you. So at one point, in the scene, the anti-Semite scene, if you could see the world, Janos turns to Ava. I've heard this story from both of them. Different, by the way. Janos says, this is the part they agree on. Janos looks at Ava and says, "You're Jewish?" And Ava says, Well, yes, but why do you ask? And he says, because you squeezed my hand during this song more than you should have. And so I suspected that you were Jewish, and now I know that you're Jewish. Ava tells the story. Yes, I'm Jewish. How'd you know? And he says, because I want to squeeze your hand more because I'm also Jewish. How Jewish? 2 parents, 4 grandparents. Jewish and more Jewish. He says, really? How come I thought you were an anti-Semite? He said it was a cover. The whole thing, right? That's how they find out. My friend who runs the Yiddish theater, the Golem Theater of Budapest, a wonderful person, Andras Borgila. I said, Andras, how'd you find out you were Jewish? He says, I was visiting my grandmother and my grandfather in one of the old Soviet bloc, apartment buildings that you have on the outskirts of Budapest. And they have a trunk line, like one phone for lots of different apartments. And he's in his grandmother's apartment, and the phone rings. He answers the phone, right? Usually that means that you have to climb up the stairs to somebody else's apartment and get them to be on the phone. So he answers the phone, and the person on the phone says, hello, this is Itzik from Tel Aviv. Is Chaim there? And Andras says, what's a Chaim? I never heard the name before. Itzik, I haven't heard Chaim, nothing. He says, please, get Chaim. If Chaim is there, please get Chaim. He says, let me assure you, there's no Chaim here. He says, how do you know? I says, I'm the grandson. There's no Chaim here. I've never even heard the name Chaim. It must be another one of the apartments. He says, no, I put a lot of effort and money into finding out that it's your apartment and you're the guys. So go get Chaim. So he says, really, there's no Chaim. I've never heard of Chaim. And all of a sudden, the door of the kitchen opens up, and his grandmother comes out and says, who's on the phone? Itzik? And he says, it's a man named Itzik. He says, Chaim, Itzik's on the phone, And he says, is that Malka? He says, yes, Malka. And Malka, his grandmother, gets on the phone, and she starts to speak to Itzik in Tel Aviv and cries. And they have an hour-long conversation. And then his grandmother looks at him and says, oh, Andras, I should tell you something about that conversation. Because that changes his life. He then becomes, he moves to Israel. He starts to learn Hebrew. Now he runs the Jewish theater of Budapest, which by the way is full every night, right? It's not a charity. It's a going concern, in which there are all sorts of plays in which deal with Jewish topics, which are all the rage in Budapest, because in Budapest everybody feels to be that Jewish. If you take a cab and you look Jewish, and I do look very Jewish. That's the way it goes. I'm happy about it. So the cab driver will always say, that's my shul over there, And I look at the cab driver and says, I'm not a tourist. I live here for many years, and I know where all the shuls are, and there's no shul there, and the cab driver says, all right, I know, but I really wanted to tell you that I'm Jewish, and I didn't know how. Or the real estate guy, we says, you'll want an apartment on the lower floors because of Shabbos. I said, it's only a 3-story building. We can walk up. We're not that old. All right, I didn't know how to tell you I'm Jewish. All the time, every day, that's what you get. Okay. Why is this story important? In the beginning, when I came to Budapest, when Annie and I came to Budapest, we heard all these stories, which were really kind of amazing, right? And there's a whole camp. There's a camp called the Sarvash camp. People have heard of it, the Sarvash camp, yeah? Sarvash camp is a JDC camp. I work for the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee. I'm a proud member of the staff of the JDC. I'm not sure they're always proud to have me, but anyways, I'm proud of them. And they do amazing work all the way around Europe of rebuilding Jewish life. That was their job, right? The end of the rescue happened, and now they're rebuilding Jewish life. I'll say some political things in a minute, because we heard Bill Kristol on Friday night, and I think I can do certainly as well as that. So, although Gertrude Himmelfarb, his mother, she was great. The JDC has a camp called the Sarvash camp, which has got to be the greatest single Jewish camp in the history of Judaism. I really, you should not go much longer in your life without visiting the Sarvash camp in the summertime. I mean, it's this unbelievable moment. The tribe of Polish Jews comes, and the tribe of Romanian Jews comes, and the big tribe of Hungarian. Kids from 6-year-olds to 17, 18-year-olds, including American Jews, right? Every year American Jews go, and some Israeli Jews go also. right? Because that's the balance of our lives. And what's the purpose of this camp? In the beginning, the purpose of the camp was to say to your kids the following lines. Hi, kids, you're going to summer camp. And guess what? It's a Jewish summer camp. And guess what else? You're a Jewish. Get on the bus. That's it. You know. And then sometimes I would go to the camp, and sometimes the parents would come to me and they would say, we didn't tell our kid the third thing, so you tell them. Tell them why they're going to this Jewish summer camp in the middle of the summer, for 2 weeks of intensive Jewish education. It surprised them at least, So and you can't imagine how many kids that are in my life who are now in their 30s, because everybody's in their 30s in Budapest. It's a 30-year-old city, a city for 30-year-olds. I turned out to be not 30. Went to the camp and found out they were Jewish when they went to that camp. And in the camp, they had a curriculum of the 2 weeks. Every day was a new holiday, right? The first holiday, Passover. The second holiday, Shavuos. And the third day, and they would, and the kids would learn. And I once went there, and there were two of the counselors, and they were crying, right? So I went over to them, and I said, "What are you crying?" They said, "Oh, two of their kids were homesick, and they left the camp." And I said, all right, it's really terrible. I understand what a tragedy it is, but all right, it's not that big a tragedy. This is Hungary after all. If you want tragedy, I can tell you. But no, and Berenbaum can tell you for sure. But why are you crying? He says, oh, no, you don't understand, Rabbi. They are the only people in their family that are going to know anything about Judaism because they came to this camp. They have to go home and teach their family about Judaism. And if they don't, no one in their whole family is going to know about it. We lost not 2 kids because they were homesick. We lost 2 families who are not going to know anything about Judaism. That's not exactly true anymore, but it still rings in my ears. It still rings in my ears. There was a kid from Ukraine in the camp. And so she's just beautiful, really lovely, tall, blonde teenager, and there was a guy from Hungary sitting next to her, and then me and another person from the UJA who were visiting the camp, and you got the sense that we really were intruding on what was happening at that table. It wasn't really about us. It was about 2 teenagers who were trying to get to know each other much better, and they certainly did not want to talk about their Jewish experience to us. They actually wanted to talk about their teenage experience to each other. But I persisted, and they didn't speak English, right? Only the girl spoke enough Hebrew to speak to me. So I said to her, where are you from? And she was from Dnipro, and I'm trying to make a conversation when she really doesn't want to talk to me. And I finally say, how did you get here? She says, well, I came last year, and I came on a train. How long does the train take? Around 25 hours, right? And I came to Sarvash, and I learned 100 words of Hebrew, right? And at the end of that session, they told me that I should go back to Dnipro, and I should put a sign on the door, and I should say, anybody that wants to learn Hebrew, come and I'll teach you 100 words of Hebrew. So she puts a sign on her door near Dnipro, and she gets a big crowd of people. 30, 40 people come to learn the 100 words of Hebrew from this teenage girl. And around 8 o'clock in the night, there's a knock on the door. It's a village just outside of Dnipropetrovsk, and there's a knock on the door, and there are policemen outside, But this is the 2017 or something like that, probably 2013, and so anyways, you're afraid, right? Anytime there's a knock, you have a bunch of Jews together, and there's a knock on the door. Even now, it's an important fact to underline. You're nervous, right? You're nervous for sure. So what does the policeman say? The policeman says, we're not here to arrest you. It's not the Soviet Union. We're here to return something to you. And what is it? They have a box that they said is in the basement of the police station. And the box has a Jewish star on it. We figure it belongs to you, right? To you people who are learning Hebrew. So they come in and they pry off the lock on the box, and they open the box, and it's a Torah. And that's how the Torah got to come back to the town. So I probably have another 500 stories like this to tell you, but I won't. And I won't because I want to talk for just a few minutes about the next phase. These, for me, are addictive stories almost, right? I'm addicted to your stories. I'm addicted to these stories, right? I 5 years ago when I moved to Budapest, and I really didn't just move to Budapest, right? I work in Warsaw, I work in Berlin, I work in Frankfurt, I work in Milan. I go to lots of places, and in other places. And I used to work in Odessa, but it's a little hot right now, so I don't go there as much. But I'm more than happy to tell you what I know about it if you're interested. But Ukraine is very close, right? You can drive a couple of hours from Budapest and you get to Ukraine. I have such funny stories about that also. I was for a while addicted to these stories because these are the stories of revival, right? But I'm really addicted to what Jessica Kate said, which is that we're all hoping for redemption, right? And during this weekend, I've talked a lot about the narrative, the Jewish narrative, particularly Rosenzweig's formulation, creation, revelation, redemption. But here I am. I'm getting older, and I have not witnessed the redemption yet. And I think we would know. I think we would know. When the redemption comes, we'll know. I'm sure we'll notice, and I haven't felt it. So I don't think that the narrative of creation, revelation, redemption is the right narrative. Otherwise, we'd be there, right? We earned it. So maybe I thought for a while it was creation, revelation, destruction, redemption. But it didn't. It's not. It's not. So I went to the March of the Living. You know the March of the Living? Quite a moving thing. And here's what it is. They take American kids, and kids from all over the world for that matter, including from Hungary. They take them to Auschwitz, just on Yom HaShoah. They march through the streets of Auschwitz. You cry. It's very moving. Then they put them on planes, and they take them to Israel. And the narrative there is basically that they came to kill us. They really killed us. We survived. Go to Israel. That's it, right? Some of the narrative is they came to kill us. We survived. Go to America, right? Get out of here. Be safe. Don't be an idiot. This place is, you will get killed if you stay in this place, right? That's the narrative. And I all of a sudden say, that can't be the narrative. That can't be the narrative. There has to be another narrative in Jewish life. There has to be the narrative of creation, revelation, maybe destruction, revival, redemption. And I wanted to go and see the miracle of the revival. And I wanted to actually even help as much as I could. But I did not go to Hungary to tell them what I knew as an American Jew that they really needed to know. I went to Hungary to learn, right? I went to Poland to learn. I went to Slovakia to learn. I went to Slovenia to learn. I went to Milan to learn. I went to all these people because they have something to teach us that's extremely precious, which is what do you do when you have suffered all the things, when your grandparents were compromised and you don't quite know the story. What do you do to put your one foot in front of the other every day and take your kids to school and build a life that has many boring evenings? That's what you want, right? That's the miracle, and I believe in that also. And so what is it? So the most amazing thing is that I believe that Seder of Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yeshua did is they said, if we're going to do this right, we are not going to inherit the Judaism and try and reestablish the Judaism that we had. We're going to build the Judaism that we need. Right? The Hungarian Jewish community was a secular Jewish community. Right? Most people, when they go there to investigate the Hungarian Jewry, they go to the synagogues. They might, the Hungarians don't. They never, right? They go to the big synagogue, the Dohan Street Synagogue, the Tabak Synagogue, as we call it, which has around 4,000 seats in it. And they go and they say, oh, it's an empty synagogue, and it's empty because of the Holocaust. But it's not true. It's an empty synagogue because the davening is boring, and nobody wants to go there. They go there once a year to see each other on Kol Nidre, and they say, hi, Andras, Gabor, nice to see you again. I'll see you next year. That's it. So they don't go because the Judaism isn't good enough. What they need is a Judaism which is more vibrant and more interesting. We used to come, the Americans, right? Not too many of us, by the way. I know who they are. Michael Schudrick in Poland, Jonathan Ornstein in Warsaw, Jeremy Borovitz in Berlin. I have them in my Rolodex. I have the entire expat American community living in Europe that are Jews in my Rolodex. We see each other all the time. You know, we go to Limud in Lvov. We go to Limud FSU in Hammerfest or in Stockholm. I mean, it's a good gig. Don't get me wrong. I love doing it. You know, my passport is very, very interesting and exciting now because I go to all these places and I know all these people. We have not made the change. Here's what I think is going to make the change. When we came to Europe, really in the beginning of the 1990s, some things had remarkably changed. The first thing was that Europe was once again Europe, right? Remember, when we were growing up, most of us, there was Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Western Europe was free and liberal, and Eastern Europe was Soviet and oppressed. But in 1989, 1990, 1991, in different places, all of a sudden there was one Europe. And so we got the idea in our head that there should be a pan-European Judaism, right? One Judaism for Europe. Because we wanted Judaism to exist there, not too much, right? But we wanted it to exist. And people would go there, like me, and I would say to the Jews there, why aren't you leaving? You know, and they would say, what do you mean, why aren't we leaving? We live here. And I would say, yeah, but it's so dangerous. Go to Israel, you know? Go to Israel because don't live here, you know? And they said, one of my friends said, you know, we didn't leave in the 1880s, and we didn't leave in the 1890s, we didn't leave in 1927, we didn't leave in 1931, we didn't leave in 1944, and we didn't leave in 1989, and we're not leaving, and just shut up, you know? We don't come to your house and say why you're not leaving. Please don't come up to our house and say, why are you not leaving? Come and help us, maybe, but do not ask us why we're not leaving. And so the challenge is to try and build a Judaism that's worth not only staying for, but that is vibrant and teaches the rest of the world. There are three major Jewish communities in the world: America, Israel, and Europe, right? Most people in America and Israel find Europe inconvenient because it lengthens the flight. You know, like it's kind of like what I think about Queens and Long Island. If we didn't have Queens, Long Island would be fine because it's right there. But we have Queens, and so it takes more than an hour to drive across Queens. Europe is kind of like Kansas City. Just to fly over, you know, like, oh, look at that, you know. Sometimes there are lights as you fly over, and it's like the tip of the Alps, always exciting. But still, nothing more, right? Why would you go there? There's only a bunch of graveyards. But it turns out, now that I've lived there for 5 years, it's wrong, you know, it's wrong. And it's very important to preserve. Partially it's important to preserve for the memory, right? You cannot go to Baghdad. And I wouldn't try and go to Tehran. I wouldn't go to all these places where we used to live, you know, in many parts of the world. But Poland and Hungary and Germany and France and all those places, I would go to those places. Not just for the memory, but for the revival, right? I would go to Krakow, and I would go to the JCC of Krakow right around the end of the spring and the beginning of the summer when we do a bicycle ride for the living. We don't go to Auschwitz and then fly to Israel. We go to Auschwitz and we ride bicycles all the way to Krakow, even me. And I do it because they like to say, if Paley can ride a bicycle that far, anybody can. That's right. I'm the advertisement, right? Anybody can ride. If I can do it, let me tell you, you can do it. So no matter who you are, you can do it. Because we don't want to leave that behind. We want those memories. We want those places. There's a nursery school for only 8 kids in Krakow. In Budapest, a nursery for 8 Jewish kids, you'd close because, you know, in Budapest, you need like 40 kids in the nursery school to make it viable. But in Krakow, to have a nursery school of 8 Jewish children is the crackling of the beginning of the revival. And I believe that revival will ultimately lead to the redemption. I used to think that this had to be a broad Jewish revival, but I don't think so anymore. Every community has something to contribute of its own memory, and every community has something to say to us that's crucial for our beginning to build a new Jewish model for the future. Yitz Greenberg, great teacher of mine and everybody else's, I think, wrote an article once, and he said there are basically 3 moments of tremendous significance in Jewish history, right? Yitzias Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt, and the response to leaving Egypt was we got the Torah, right? Torah, very good, excellent. I've personally made my living on it for many years, and really the Torah, great book. And if you don't like what I'm talking about now, I can break back into the Torah at any minute. And then after the destruction of the temple, of the second temple, Talmud, Mishnah and Talmud, right? Also great. Study it every day. Wonderful. And now we've had these two events, the Shoah and the founding of the State of Israel. We need to respond to it with something at the same magnitude, really, as Torah and of Talmud. And where will that come from? I believe it will come from those places. There are some challenges, really even obstacles. One of the obstacles is that 20 years ago, Europe was coming together. Now, in my view, living in Europe, Europe is actually fracturing. I was in Poland about, 6 weeks ago, I think, and I talked to this guy, and he was complaining about the EU. You know, the EU, the European Union. The European Union has spent more money in Poland than I think any place else, by far. They built fantastic. So he says, he's complaining. I said, but really, don't you think that this is the last, let's say, 30 years have been the best years in Poland in all of Polish history? I mean, more roads, more schools. You agree, at least. I convinced you. I agree because we're the Jews. More industry, more education that positions them for prosperity. I say this is the greatest 30 years in all of Polish history. He says it's the worst 30 years in Polish history. I said, how could it be the worst 30 years? That's ridiculous. He says, we are less Polish now than we've ever been. In the back of my mind, just like in the back of yours, I'm saying that could be a benefit. But no, you can't say that, right? I can barely understand that. But there's no doubt that that Europe itself, which did not benefit from its struggles. I think those are people that are cheering for me. I always think that. So one of the obstacles is as the countries proliferate, so will the Jewish communities, right? The Jewish communities are very different, and they'll be further. I'm building a program that we used to build programs like Sarvash that brought Jews from all over Europe together to build the European identity. I'm now building a program. I've built a program which will try and build leadership cadres in each of the European countries so that they can know each other, that they have a common language and some common education, but they can share what they learn. No longer am I thinking about a pan-European program. Another obstacle. Without doubt, we are seeing the rise of the Catholic Church in the more autocratic aspects of Europe, right? And particularly, it's particularly visible in Hungary, but it's not only visible in Hungary. It's visible in many, many places. And it's not the Catholic Church of John the 23rd or even John Paul II. It's a much more revivalist and extremist Catholicism. And if this happens, that's a real obstacle and something to worry about. Third, do I need to stop soon? Yeah, okay. I can stop on a dime. You'd be amazed. I do want to say one more thing, though, about this. We're also seeing Europe in tremendous change. If you go to Berlin, there are about 100,000 Jews, I think, in Berlin now. About 30,000 of them are Russian. About 40,000 of them are Israeli. About 25,000 of them are American. And then there are some Germans, three Germans in there, and they're scared. So, and so we haven't had a city like that for a long time, where the great Jewish, where young people from the great Jewish communities have gathered together. And by the way, even because of the rise of authoritarianism in Hungary, Hungarians are moving to Berlin and Vienna and places like that. So this it's an exciting city, a complicated city, right? Budapest is the last place I think in which it's mostly Hungarian because no one can learn that language, particularly me. Although I can count very well in Hungarian, so when people ask me questions, I count for them, which they seem to enjoy. The Ukrainian war will have a fantastic impact. There are maybe 300,000 Jews living in Ukraine. We know from history that most refugees do not go home. Most of the Ukrainian refugees are going to Europe. They are not coming to America or even Israel. That's the fact, right? There were 1.2 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland before the war, right? There are 2 million that have come since the war. That's 3.2 million Ukrainians living in Poland, and it means that whole Jewish communities are now residing, at least, in Poland. If you went to Ljubljana for Purim, my friend was in he said, I always go to Purim, and there are always like 30 Jews there for Purim, and this year there were 200, and of the 200, 170 were Ukrainians. They were all from Kiev and from Kharkiv, and they all came, and they all spoke Ukrainian, and I think they're not leaving, right? That's what he said. I think they're not leaving. So that means that small Jewish communities like Krakow, like Ljubljana, like Bratislava, like even Frankfurt, Cologne, places like that in Germany, now are all of a sudden, there are Jews coming. First the Russians came, but 1 million Russians went to Israel and 1 million came to America. So which is a moment of human miracle that we'll never see again. But right now, the Ukrainians are coming to Europe, and they are repopulating places that have big infrastructures. And all of a sudden, there are Jews in places that there were not Jews before. Even in Budapest, there's an entire Ukrainian Jewish kind of a Chabad congregation, which is very vibrant and very moving. And we don't have people in Budapest that can lane Torah and things like that, and all of a sudden we have people that can do that. So that you have to think of Europe and the revival of Jewish life as a continent in flux. I just want to say one more thing, and then I'm having fun, so I don't think that I can finish this without a little bit of anti-Semitism, because after all, it's Europe. Anti-Semitism in Europe has an amazing impact. If you think about America for just a second, I'm as woke as the next guy, so I'm a liberal from the '60s. I'm woke, but one of the things about being woke in America is that you have to put your victimhood out a little bit, and we don't really have a convenient victimhood in America. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston. It's hard to conjure. So so we have to go all the way back to the pogroms. You don't know about the pogroms? To get it in my family. But in Europe, it's not true because of your stories. Nobody quite trusts the government. In our lifetime, the Jewish community will not trust the government. And in our lifetime, the Jewish community will not feel integrated into the country. And in our lifetime, the Jewish community will not feel any sense of comfort that they can just assimilate into it, because they'll say to you that, and they'll say it right out, that the ultra-Orthodox didn't know and they died, but the big losers in the Holocaust in Europe were the assimilated Jews, who had thought that they had put the whole thing behind them, and they hadn't, right? So these populations of Jews that are secular and engaged and vibrant and searching also know that if they're going to live in these communities, they are going to have to develop something for themselves. In Western Europe, France, in all the countries that had colonial possessions in the Islamic world, there are big populations of Muslims, and there's a lot of tension in those places, and it's physical tension, right? Physical tension, no doubt. If you go to Drancy, where the deportations were, it's mostly an Algerian city now, and all the street signs are in Arabic, and you can't miss it, and you don't feel at home, Like I asked one of the people, and I said, "Do you feel French?" He says, "No, we hate the French, because what do? They drink wine. We don't drink wine. They eat funny bread. We eat flat bread. They eat long bread." He says, "There's nothing French about us. We're part of the Ummah of Europe. We're part of the Muslim community of Europe, and we don't feel at home there. And when things happen to us in one part of the Islamic world, we take it out on the Jews." He's just like right out and said that. But in Eastern and Central Europe, I think I'm from Central Europe, but most Hungarians admit that we're really from Eastern Europe. Central Europe is like a fake, but it's a nice one. They say that there's always been anti-Semitism, and there's some fear about that, but it's usually not violent, right? It's usually verbal and a feeling. As authoritarian, Orban and other leaders get stronger and stronger and rile up the crowds, that might not be so true, right? And that sense of insecurity that hangs over the Jewish world is significant. We have to also know that it's present in America also, right? And it's even present in Israel. So where, if you're a Jew and you want to run, where are you running? I leave you with one final comment, which is my friend Zsuzsa Tironi, or as we say in Hungarian, Tironi Zsuzsa, that's what we say, Paley Michael. She is the head of the archive of Budapest. And she says to me regularly, I need a backup plan. If this place falls apart, where should I send the archive? Jerusalem or New York? And I don't know the answer. I think that she should keep it in Budapest. And I think that it becomes stronger if all of us go and visit, and I will welcome you in my house. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Paley. Thank you, Rabbi Berenbaum. Thank you, Jim, for helping make this happen. To all of you, to Basia and to Jessica Kate Meyer and to Oren for their beautiful music and thoughts. And hopefully we'll see you at more Jewish Studio events in the future. Bye-bye.